Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today, where we're going to be speaking about enablers to collaboration. I am Natalka Sumok, and I hear a lot of noise, and I'm not sure if it's just me or all of you, but just thought I'd mention it in case it's just me. Uh, my name is Natalka Sumok, so I'm the Director General for Science and Policy for Laboratories Canada. And I'm here with a very exciting group of panelists that I will introduce in a moment. But before we begin, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So I thought I'd give everybody a heads up that I'm actually speaking to you today from Berlin, but Laboratories Canada, the main office is in Ottawa, our nation's capital, which is located on the ancestral and ceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and more specifically, Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabe and the Algonquins of Pikwatagan First Nations. And we extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation for their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. We also recognize and respect the cultural diversity of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation bring to our country and their significant contribution to science and knowledge. And so we are very happy to be here today to speak to you a little bit about collaboration in science. Now, scientists do collaborate. That's not a concern, but we all know that perhaps the conditions to enable collaborations aren't always there. And I am working for the Government of Canada, an initiative called Laboratories Canada, which is a 25-year strategy to help enable federal science, mandated federal science, research and development for Canada. And I'm here today with a group of people who will speak to us on various barriers to collaboration. And more importantly, will offer their suggestions and their provocative ideas. I hope they'll be provocative, they're not shy, to tell us a little bit about some ways that we can do better in government. So some individuals here work in government, most outside of government. They have a very varied background and work, of course, with government. And we are hoping that today they will share their thoughts and ideas on some of the work and ambitions that we have ahead of us. So with that, I will ask each member to please give a little bit of introduction of themselves. And in particular, if you could describe to us what you are doing differently in terms of your own work, your own past, anything that you would like to raise with us. So we've included a very interesting group here who will speak not just from their current position, but also from the experience that they bring forward. So with that, I will turn first to Roseanne Runte, please.
Hello, I'm Roseanne Runte, and I'm President and CEO of the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And I'm really pleased to be on this panel because it offers the opportunity to share ideas with the audience on new possible collaborations. And if I think of one thing that I'm doing this week that is really exciting, it's working together with the 3 research councils and ISED and public health on the Biosciences Research Fund. And it's interesting because it's a very bold initiative. It crosses agencies, disciplines, universities, hospitals, industry, and business, all in the interests of health and the well-being of Canadians. And that's about as exciting as I can imagine.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to have you here. I'll now turn to Malcolm Campbell, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I think there's an audio problem associated with my particular line. I'm going to pause and see if I can't find a solution to that and just ask that you move on to the next speaker, please.
Apologies for that. I hope that gets resolved very soon because we definitely want Malcolm as part of this discussion. With that, I'll turn to Walter Dixon, please.
Thanks very much, Natalka, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Dixon. I'm the Associate Vice President, Research and Priority Initiatives at the University of Alberta. I've been in the office of the VPRI for, this is my 7th year. I've served as interim VP Research and Innovation on 2 occasions within that period. So I've seen both looking down from the responsibility to top of the pyramid to other roles within the portfolio. I'm a biochemist and molecular biologist by training. I've been at the University of Alberta for this is my 33rd year, and I came up through the ranks and was responsible for developing some core facilities within my faculty. What specifically one called the Agricultural Genomics and Proteomics Unit, which took advantage of a lot of CFI funding over the years, and we built a very good facility that shares equipment and infrastructure amongst a very large number of researchers. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about the concept of core facilities during this discussion this afternoon, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there's a lot. I know that many of you know each other and work closely together, but you mentioned genomics. So with that, I'll turn to Catalina Lopez Correa, please.
Thank you, Natalka. And my name is Catalina Lopez Correa. I am Chief Scientific Officer for Genome Canada. I have been in the field of genomics in the last 25 years, worked in the US, worked in Europe, and came to Canada in 2008 to be working with Genome Quebec for some years, Genome BC, and now Genome Canada. In terms of exciting things I'm doing right now and bold and different, I think for me, the most challenging role in my career is the one I have now, or I had, because now I'm Chief Scientific Officer for Genome Canada, but I'm still acting as the Executive Director for the Canadian COVID Genomics Network. And that's basically an initiative, $40 million initiative, aiming at using genomics to sequence the viral genomes and the human genomes. And just imagine working with all the public health labs across Canada, trying to share the data, building the infrastructure, the capacity to have a decentralized genome sequencing in the midst of a pandemic, where everybody has lots of priorities and lots of things to worry about in terms of genomic surveillance. So it has been a very interesting ride where we have been forced to think outside of the box, to bring solutions and to bring innovation. And actually the good news is that it's really paying off because we're seeing a lot of progress on that front. And I can give more details, but yeah, thinking about out of the box, Cancogen will be that out of the box initiative that I'm involved now.
Very much. Well, the pandemic has definitely given us pause and a good opportunity to really put science to action in very real time. So I hope we'll be able to speak to that a little bit today. And I don't know if Malcolm has quite joined us, but I'll now turn to Fred Rona, who he's also a colleague of mine. So
please note that I can't hear any of the other speakers now.
Is this Malcolm speaking?
I believe that was Malcolm, yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll turn it to you, Fred.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, good evening, Natalka, considering that you are in Berlin, and good afternoon, everybody else and fellow panelists. I'm Fred Rona. I'm actually, some of the exciting things I'm working on, a little bit of my background. I've been retired now from the government of Alberta Environment and Parks as their inaugural chief scientist back probably about a year and a half now, and also was the assistant deputy minister of a newly created environmental monitoring and science division at that time. Prior to that, and coming and working back in Alberta again, I worked in the federal science system for probably close to 24 years in capacities as a senior science strategist for Environment Climate Change Canada, as a senior research scientist, and then also as a program director and project chief on a number of national, international initiatives over that time period. So I've been involved in a number in the design and implementation on a number of multidisciplinary regional, national, international science programs that certainly very much always had a key element of infrastructure associated with it. And what I hope to bring to the panel discussion today is maybe some of the experiences that I've had in working in some of those domains, and how we can basically enable and use infrastructure as a tool and a mechanism by which for us to promote innovation in the Canadian science system, and also really bridge multiple disciplines in that kind of regard. What I'm working on now is exciting. Well, it's showing that I work for Public Services and Procurement Canada. I'm actually an advisor, an external advisor. My main role is I hold a research chair at the University of Calgary, and I'm working with themselves, with the VPR's office there, and in fact with other colleagues. Whether it be like Walter and others, and other universities and other groups. I'm trying to build bridges and program areas related to water and other sciences. The genomics component is a key part of what we've been sort of building in, but we are looking at designing and building sort of new One Health approaches to issues like climate change and water, which in itself is beginning to open up doors and domains, including the recognition and utilization of Indigenous knowledge as part of that portfolio. So that's what's exciting for me now, other than my other core research that I do on climate and water issues. But that's certainly keeping me preoccupied at the moment.
Thank you, Fred. And Laboratories Canada's very lucky to have you as an advisor. So thank you. I think Malcolm's now joined us. Malcolm, can you hear us? And if so, would you mind just providing an introduction of yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Malcolm Campbell. I'm Vice President of Research at University of Guelph. And I'm still having audio problems. My apologies.
Hear you, Malcolm. Do you want me to introduce you, or are you okay?
And the problem is I've got myself very loudly in my ear.
Oh, I see.
It's very difficult to follow the conversation. So can you hear me okay right now?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. So my name is Malcolm Campbell. I'm Vice President of Research at University of Guelph, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate today. I want to apologize for the audio challenges that have existed here with the system. As Vice President of University of Guelph, obviously I oversee a research enterprise of around $160 million a year that has, as part and parcel of that, considerable infrastructure that we make use of to realize the research ambitions of our 830 researchers across that research enterprise. A key component of that is entirely relevant to our discussions with regards to Laboratories Canada is a partnership that we have with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, which is a $70 million a year partnership where we manage considerable infrastructure on behalf of the Agricultural Research Institute of Ontario, about 8,600 acres of cropland that we manage, and significant state-of-the-art facilities for crops and livestock. Why I raise that in the context of Laboratories Canada is that through the management of that infrastructure, we're able to address the priorities of, in this instance, the agri-food sector, to address those real-world priorities by bringing researchers to that infrastructure in novel ways that enable them to do things to address those real-world challenges in real-world settings. As I often say, we are production scale, but not production dependent, which enables us to manipulate the system and derive outcomes, solutions that are relevant in those real-world contexts. I believe that this is a way of doing science differently, and it's something that I think provides a little bit of a template, a blueprint, if you will, for how we might think about how to do science differently through the Laboratories Canada initiative. And I think in the interest of time, I'll pause there. I look forward to addressing the future questions that we get as part of the panel. And I should say this afternoon that I'm speaking to you from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit here in Guelph, where we honor the longstanding traditions that have been held by the Mississaugas on this traditional territory and ensure that we're rebuilding relationships with them through the process of truth and reconciliation. Thanks, Natalka, for the opportunity to join you today.
Thanks to all of you for being here, and I hope doesn't prevent you from partaking in this conversation. So we've decided, all of us, to have a bit of a conversational style to this panel. So just for the audience to be aware that we have a couple of questions, but we're also winging it at the same time. And please, if you have questions, there are people taking note of the questions, so send them our way, and we'll make sure that we integrate them into the conversation as we move forward. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of themes that we were hoping to talk about, but we will be flexible and adjust as the conversation takes us. And so given that we want to talk about the labs and how do you think about labs differently, and I think the way all of you have set it up takes us there very, very nicely. How do we think more innovatively? Infrastructure can be really tough because it takes a long time to build, and you don't want it to be outdated by the time it's actually in place. And also there's the challenge of it being very much location based. And so in terms of some of the principles that all of us collectively want to make sure are things like making sure that we're agile and flexible, that we are attracting and retaining good talent from all over Canada, but also from other parts of the world. So infrastructure can help us realize that innovation and be an attractive force to attract talent here, but it could also be an inhibitor. And so to get us a little bit started on that particular topic, I'm going to ask Roseanne to lead us off to maybe give her thoughts on what she sees as infrastructure and its role in realizing innovation, and especially in terms of like planning, fostering collaboration and innovation, how placing people together, how reflecting on your own experience, Roseanne. How can we do that using infrastructure? And then let us know if anybody else would like to pipe in on that question. Over to you, Roseanne.
Thank you so much, Natalka. I think it would be really helpful if everyone imagined a giant jigsaw puzzle with the pieces strewn right across the table. And we start to create order by locating the edge pieces and constructing the frame. If you've done a jigsaw puzzle before, that's kind of standard procedure. An infrastructure provides the structure in which and with which creative and innovative research and discovery can occur. Infrastructure can open up all sorts of opportunities, and it is itself the first step. It's the framework for that jigsaw puzzle. When building research facilities, we think of safety, economy, convenience, but we also think of the flow of people and ideas. And if we want to encourage interdisciplinarity, we need to create the space for this to occur. If we want to welcome industry and business to labs, we need to have spaces where they can confer and collaborate while providing a secure environment. If we want to be more inclusive, we have to create spaces that are welcoming to all. This may well mean simply a place to rest or a place for conversations. One professor told me that he had worked at a large research facility in Texas for 5 years. He never met anyone in any of the other labs in his building. And he was amazed to learn one day that a whole large number of researchers had all been assigned the same problem, but never told they might collaborate. On the other end of the spectrum, you can go to CERN in Switzerland, or even closer by in Canada to Perimeter Labs, and go to the lunchroom. And those places are hives of conversation and ideas. You can actually practically see the ideas bouncing around like so many quantum particles in the room. So let's assume that we've built a lovely frame that permits this activity to occur. And now we need to create the picture. And this is rather difficult because all the pieces that we're given are cut in certain shapes, and they all have colors that only fit together just so, like agencies and departments.
Hello, now I can't hear anyone except myself.
Oh, can I continue? I guess. Anyway, the pieces that we can't change are somewhat like agencies and departments that follow mandates and regulations. They're like people who follow traditions. They're like people who simply believe that collaboration is not possible, and so why should we try? We need to break out of this and have a renewed common vision, but at the same time, we can only use the pieces that we have. So the task appears daunting. But when we look around, we notice that there are other tables, and on every table is another jigsaw puzzle. And all the pieces can be combined or exchanged. And perhaps we could be innovative by trading and sharing pieces. In the case of research infrastructure, there are many possible partners. We have the means and the motivation for change. Working together becomes a necessity if we want to achieve a vision, which, after all, must be to support excellent research in service to Canada, to Canadians, and the world. At the CFI, we're fairly accustomed to this methodology of sharing, as we use a 40-60 funding formula that allows us to leverage investments and attract other funders. And unless they already have partners lined up, all of our lucky grant recipients embark instantly on a hunt for collaborators. Among those collaborators are and can be and should be and hopefully will be more federal labs, who themselves may be motivated not only by the infrastructure, the equipment that the researchers bring, but by the brilliant researchers themselves. Now, the researchers and their equipment come with contingencies. For example, they might even want to introduce some students to the lab. Would this affect security? Well, that and other questions can certainly be accommodated if there is an advantage for everyone. Universities are always short of space. Federal labs might be happy to have access to some additional cutting-edge equipment. Federal researchers are not necessarily professors, but they can be named as adjuncts. And students may be the next generation of federal researchers staffing the labs. So the short answer to the question posed is that infrastructure can provide the framework for collaboration and the motivating factor that facilitates it while enabling a strong vision. This may result in a change in culture for everyone to see the possibilities and imagine how the puzzle will come together. However, I believe that enough forward-thinking and brilliant participants will step forward if the opportunity is made clearly available, and they will become models for others to follow. I'm personally very inspired by the thought that Labs Canada and Labs Canada facilities could welcome academic researchers. Universities would consider locating equipment from the CFI in these labs. It would be a win-win situation and would be a match that would make all our investments more valuable and make them have a greater impact. This is a vision that needs to be shared. And I'd like to thank every member of the audience today, because I hope you will all be messengers and share this idea and help make it happen. Thank you.
Roseanne. And I have my sincere apologies to Hope Wheeler, who I missed in our introductions. So with that, and it's very suitable that we would introduce you right now, because you very much live what Roseanne has described, having lived in both worlds. But I'll let you introduce yourself, Hope, please.
Thank you so much, Natalka, and thank all of you for your conversations so far, all leading up to this point. I just wanted to thank you for the invitation to participate, and also echo that I'm speaking to you today from the Anishinaabe Algonquin unceded territory just west of Ottawa. So it's a wonderful place to be, and working in Health Canada as a research scientist is also a fantastic way to essentially end my career, I believe. So you're right, I've worked in both worlds. I've come to Health Canada only 3 years ago, and I came to Health Canada from academia, and I've worked in more than one institution, and I've benefited from working in all of them, as well as alongside many of the federal funding agencies, including CFI, CIHR, NSERC, and a host of other smaller agencies as well. So I really have a different perspective, a little bit the reverse of Fred, in terms of I've had my academic career. I've had opportunity to work with people from all over the world, especially trainees. And I bring insight from that perspective as to how the needs of the younger generation, the next generation of scientists, are changing, their desire to collaborate, their need to collaborate. And one of the reasons I'm really excited to talk today is because I have a perspective in my area which is focused on vitamin D. I'm in the Nutrition Research Division of the Health Products and Food Branch. And when you think about vitamin D status of Canadians and anybody throughout the world, you need a very good biomarker. We seem to have a good biomarker, but we don't seem to have portable technology to measure it. So international portability and traceability of an assay is critical. And that's one thing that we do exceptionally well at Health Canada. We do as well as CDC, the NIST, and we're one of the few laboratories throughout the world who's been able to generate this assay with such high degree of accuracy and precision. So trainees and researchers who work with us would benefit from that technology, and they have already. And in addition, what we're embarking upon next week is the starting point for looking at a very large assessment with the Canadian Health Measures Survey cycles 1 through 6. That's about 30,000 people who have been studied so far for vitamin D status. And we have a standardized assay that can do this. So I think we might be the first in the world to show what you can do with standardized assays. And in doing so, be able to start looking at subgroups of populations, and then to be able to look at where do we need to do more work? How do we find those underrepresented, hard to reach groups in order to improve the health of Canadians? So I'm super excited to talk with you today. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to be working in government. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. So both you and Roseanne have now mentioned some ideas in terms of mobility, and it sounds easy, and Hope, you've lived it, and many of you have, but we hear this often as actually a challenge. And yet it seems to be one of the key ingredients to really get that innovation and collaboration across disciplines, across institutions. At least that's what I understand. And I'm wondering how true that is. Like, do you feel that for scientists, one of the major obstacles truly is like sort of rest with institutional mandates, or is it more HR policies, data systems? We often hear that intellectual property is a big barrier. So I would just be curious to know this, and perhaps I could turn to Walter to get us started on this conversation.
Thanks, Natalka. Happy to kick it off. I probably should have said more in my introductory remarks to sort of set the stage a little bit for what I'm going to talk about now. But I think one of the questions that was sort of posed in our earlier discussions was sort of, what does doing science differently mean to you? So I want to do that just before I jump into some of those potential barriers, because I think the landscape has changed somewhat. That means we need to think differently. So as I think many of you recognize now, that science has become increasingly team-based, and interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary in its nature. And the driving force, I think, behind that is that many of the questions that we're asking now are addressing global challenges, or what we can call wicked problems, whether it's climate change, energy sustainability, environmental challenges, emerging diseases, invasive species. I could go on. Cybersecurity, migration and refugee issues, all kinds of things. But they're very complex problems, and the sort of the lone wolf researcher working by themselves is not going to be able to address those kind of very large questions. So it does change the need for that we need to address those big questions. One of the things that I saw in the Lab Canada mandate online was their determination that they need to be able to collaborate with academia, with industry, with international partners. And I think in addition to that, I think Canada wants to be globally relevant. In some of the things that we strive to do, we're working in an international arena. And if we want to be credible competitors or partners, whichever way you want to look at it, we need to have the kind of state-of-the-art equipment and infrastructure in order to have that credibility. And that goes to addressing some of the big science challenges that we have in the country, whether it's Triumph or Canadian Light Source or Snow Lab, these very big installations that are multi hundreds of millions of dollars in scope. CFI has a mandate; they're doing a wonderful job. But some of these big science projects require a sort of another scale. So that's something I think we need to look at. We also have the challenge of replacing aging infrastructure and evergreening our equipment in our laboratories. At the same time, we want to be flexible, we want to be agile, nimble, whatever you want to say. And we certainly saw that in spades with the Cancogen that Catalina referred to, the sort of the response to COVID. We were able to move very, very quickly as part of an international initiative and achieve great things in terms of vaccine development. So that's another situation we need to be aware of. We also, I think, as a country, want to be more efficient in the use of our equipment, or the sharing of resources. Roseanne talked a little bit about that, but also personnel training, mobility between organizations to allow our HQP to develop all of their skill sets and to really be internationally competitive. So with that sort of rather lengthy introduction, let me turn to the question that Natalka posed about some of the barriers to that mobility I referred to. So Natalka mentioned IP. When we talk about different organizations, whether it's academia and federal labs, et cetera, there are jurisdictional differences in the way that we manage intellectual property, potential routes to commercialization of things that come out of research. And so sort of overarching, handshake agreements between organizations is something that we need to really work on. So there's not, months and months or years of engagement of lawyers to try to sort out these kinds of challenges. Simply also space and access to space is not always trivial. When you're talking about people working in one organization and having access to laboratory space in another organization, even trivial things like swipe cards, getting in and out and getting that sort of managed and handled is sometimes a surprising challenge. Equipment sharing, coming up with agreements on how that equipment, if shared, will be maintained, and who's liable if it breaks, if it blows up. What happens then? Is the host organization or the user who happened to be unfortunate enough to be on the equipment when it failed? Occupational health and safety. Different organizations have different requirements. I can speak from experience on our campus. We host the Nanotechnology Research Center, a partnership with NRC on our campus. And it's a fantastic facility. And I would say overall it's working extremely well. But, just in the way we manage the sort of COVID vaccine access to the facilities and how the different organizations were managing that, and proof of vaccination and things like that became a challenge. You know, in recent months, we've got through that, but that was something that we had to deal with. Information technology and information management, you know, everything from cybersecurity to research data management, and more increasingly now, you've seen a lot of activity, particularly with NSERC and the Alliance program, instructions from ISET about safeguarding our research. That's becoming an increasing focus as we are concerned about international actors and their access potentially to our data sources. So putting in protections in place for that. Human resource systems, I mean, collective agreements, different organizations, different unions, that also presents challenges for mobility of personnel across different organizations. I've already mentioned aging infrastructure and equipment evergreening, the huge problem in many of our laboratories across the country, both in federal labs and in academia, of deferred maintenance, huge deferred maintenance balloons that need to be dealt with at some point. So those are a couple of things. And then finally, funding sources, eligibility to access funding between different agencies and different organizations, not always straightforward. So I don't want to present it as an intractable problem, because I don't think it is. I think these things can be negotiated, but perhaps we need to systematically look at that and figure out ways that we can do things better and make things easier for researchers to be able to access the best equipment, the best facilities in the country, and to get the training that our HQP need. So I'll leave it at that, Natalka, but happy to respond to questions as they come.
Yes, thank you very much. So there's a lot of good provocative thoughts out there. I was hoping Hope could has just described, she lived this experience, having worked in one place and now moved over to Health Canada at a new institution, new sets of guidelines and rules. And I would just be curious to know, how easy was that? Is it, I imagine that culturally it must be very challenging to switch, but I don't know. I haven't lived your experience, but I would love to hear from you, just to maybe share your experience of having actually lived that mobility yourself.
Well, for me, it was a great experience, and I have to say it wasn't that hard. I think the biggest challenge was visibility, knowing of the opportunities, and then to be able to seize them. So I think in order for people to be mobile, we need to know of the opportunities that are there. And once you find out the opportunities and the depth of the work that can be done and future collaborations, you can see that it's really worth making a change. For me, I think that some of the challenges we think about are the same for other people and other institutions and agencies. And so I hear quite often, okay, welcome to government. You know, this is the way it is. It might take a little while to do something. And I reflect on that and I say, you know, I think it's just institutions. You know, if you have to write a grant, you're going to take a little while to write the grant, submit the grant. Somebody has to review your grant. And then you're going to find out, did you receive the funding or not? Then you have to administer the grant. So everything takes time. And I think what Labs Canada can do is help us find out where we have mutual interests and begin to start a process where all of our mandates could work under some sort of a framework of an agreement. Maybe we should start with areas that we think are most feasible now, which may not necessarily be in the discovery area per se, because that might be where patents could be and intellectual property. But maybe we should start with what we can manage now and to think about ways to move forward with everybody involved, whether it be trainees, researchers, whoever else might need to be involved, managers, so on and so forth for decision making, and who has access and reliability checks and so on and so forth. There's a lot to think about. And I also very much wanted to bring forward, and it's a bit provocative, is the concept of cross appointments and adjunct status is something we all know about. People in government have appointments in universities as adjunct professors, sometimes in multiple universities. There are probably fewer scientists who are in academia who have an appointment in government. And I think we need to work on that. And that would open a lot of doorways for us to do work, for us to train the next generation of scientists, to share equipment, to have these discussions that we're having today about how do we do this in a way that meets everybody's needs and is responsible to Canada, both fiscally as well as using equipment, discovery, surveillance, and health of Canadians. So I think we can do a lot, start maybe a little bit small, and maybe have a multi-tiered process, thinking big and getting there over time. And I realize this is a 25-year plan, so breaking it up into 3 to 5 year goals in terms of what can we do now and what should we be aiming for might work.
It took me a second to unmute. You all of you have raised some ideas and have mentioned a few things. So I love the image that you, Roseanne, had put, sort of puzzle pieces. And many of you have raised sort of, we're dealing with big, large, serious issues, big problems, wicked problems, I believe someone had put it. And many of these, I imagine, to really be able to solve would require a transdisciplinary approach, which is what Labs Canada is trying to support with this hub. They are taking more of a sort of a thematic approach, which I'll speak to in a moment. But I wanted to turn to some of you to talk about that as sort of transdisciplinary, and especially scientists are trained in an area, a particular discipline. It's the same way government is thinking, you know, we have our departmental mandates, but yet the issues that we're trying to solve globally are not single mandate problems. And in fact, I would like to push it even further, that they might not rely only on science solution. Maybe they require a little bit more of that demographic, social science input to understand where we're going, or maybe it's an opportunity to really, and many of you have mentioned the land acknowledgement, but it's bringing in that Indigenous knowledge into a lot of our questions. I'm thinking of water, food security, climate. So how do we do that? And I know some of you haven't spoken yet, so I'd like to turn to some of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Catalina. You could take it in any direction you'd like, but I think it's something you're experiencing right now. Over to you.
Absolutely, and thanks, Natalka. And I will maybe make a comment before I go into the multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary aspects. I'd like to make a comment about mobility, and it's almost, you know, a comment based on my experience working in Quebec with Genome Quebec, working in BC with Genome BC, and working now with Genome Canada, and also having worked internationally in the world of genomics. I think there's so much to gain, not only for us as professionals, but for the organizations when we have these connections between people moving from one, getting the perspective of the provincial versus the federal in my case. So I think there is a lot that can be done and a lot that can be gained on that mobility. And I like the examples that were provided here. In terms of transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, well, this is exactly what we do at Genome Canada. And as you know, genomics is a technology, but it's really cross-sectorial. So we are typically, for our projects and our initiatives, looking at different sectors. And one concrete example that we have right now that I think we're all very aware is One Health. And Fred mentioned that at the beginning, One Health in relation to climate change, in relation to water, in relation to our human health. So these interactions between animals, between humans, between the environment, plants, all that. So taking that into account, most of our projects are taking that multidisciplinary approach, using genomics as a technology that enable us to provide solutions in a multi-sectorial manner. And we are adding to that another level, which is bringing different disciplines to work on those large-scale projects. So it's not just about the genomic scientist or the bioinformatician, but it's also about the social scientist We have several of our projects that are now building on traditional indigenous knowledge, that are working on the aquaculture, agriculture areas. We have one project, Silent Genomes, that is on human health for rare diseases, that is all in collaboration with social scientists and genomicists and, well, medical doctors from First Nations and from indigenous populations. So it's bringing all this knowledge to help us advance on the implementation of genomics. The other aspect that goes also to the infrastructure and, related to, of course, the work Roseanne and CFI are doing in terms of the platforms, it is also, and we see it a lot in the core facilities that Walter mentioned at the beginning, the core facilities that are focusing on single technology, like, sequencing or genomics, providing these as a multi-sectorial approach. Now what we have, most of our platforms are focusing on human health, focusing on a particular area, but what about thinking of these platforms in a multi-sectorial manner, that they could serve the needs from multiple sectors, that they could sequence, because at the end of the day, sequence DNA, if it's from a human, if it's from a tree, if it's from an animal, it's just DNA, and you can sequence it. Of course, you need some expertise for the analysis, but that could be somewhat decentralized. So bringing that concept of multidisciplinary service and multidisciplinary support and use of the infrastructures we're putting together, I think could leave a great edge to Canada and to the work we're doing in genomics. Now, the other aspect that I think it is important to bring, and just to close here, is a little bit of the learnings from Cancogen. And, well, as you know, Cancogen, $40 million initiative, I think 3 key elements that have been a good learning for us, for the ones involved, and I think for all Canada, around the use of genomics during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is data sharing, and that goes also for our infrastructure in our platforms. I think sharing of the data and developing the platforms in a way that they are totally connected and that they're able to share the data, I think is critical. That was one of the biggest barriers and biggest challenges, and it is still, even though we have made a lot of progress in data sharing in terms of the SARS-CoV-2 sequencing. We started having a lot of difficulties to share that data across provinces, because it's public health data, because it's regulated, because it's protected, even though there's no risk for security or privacy breaches, because it's the sequence of the virus and not the sequence of the human, but still many challenges in terms of data sharing. I think the other learning is that we can say today that Cancogen has been successful because it's not because of $40 million, even though it's great to have $40 million for that, and that makes a whole difference. But it's because we set up an environment of collaboration and really inter and multidisciplinary collaborations with Cancogen. We were bringing the public health labs, we were bringing the academics, we were bringing the private sector. We were, of course, working very close with ICED and Health Canada, PHAC, the National Microbiology Lab, all these entities that typically don't really talk to each other, and they're not really on the same page in terms of collaboration. They bring a whole different perspective to the table, but we managed to get them all together and talk about genomic surveillance and advancing those genomic tools to help us understand and control this pandemic and make important policy and public health decisions based on genomic data. That's unprecedented to see that we're closing the border between the US and Canada using genomic data. I don't think that if we were, guessing these 20 years ago, we will say, oh yeah, in 2021 or 2020, we will get the genome of the virus, and that will help us make the decision to close the border between Canada and the US. Again, that's big. And the third that is linked to the collaboration is the reason of the question, Nataka, which is multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And I think Cancogen, again, is an example of the work that Genome Canada led on this very multi and transdisciplinary manner that is helping bring all this different knowledge including a component that we have now. We are advancing more and more on equity. As we know, equity is the biggest challenge of this pandemic. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're working closely. We have a committee now to try and advance all the genomic surveillance and the knowledge we're generating, and include indigenous groups, and include really bring that aspect of equity, diversity, and inclusion at the forefront of these initiatives.
Thank you very much. Sometimes it takes an emergency or something urgent to really pull people together, and we just saw that very clearly. Unfortunately, we have lost Malcolm due to technological issues, which is really unfortunate. But with that, I will invite you, Fred, to add to the discussion on transdisciplinary, as I know this is something that is very close to your heart, as I often hear you speak about it.
Well, thank you, Natalka. And really, what I have to add is really building upon many of the salient comments that my panel colleagues have already raised in terms of the importance and the direction of transdisciplinary approaches now to actually move forward and address the very complex issues that have been identified. I think, Walter, you gave good examples, of ranging from climate change to, to biotechnological issues that we have to deal with. Hope in terms of many of the areas in the Health Canada side, the genomic side, Catalina and Roseanne, the puzzle pieces that we have in terms of the institutional, I would say, maybe I'll use baggage as the term. We come at some of these problems based on the history of how we've done things, rather than turning it on its head and saying, all right, how should we approach it with a blank slate? And I think one of the things that the Labs Canada program maybe can provide an opportunity for is turning things around on its head a bit, in that recognizing from the onset that for us to address some of these very complex scientific, societal, economic issues facing this country and many parts of the world, how do we build this now? Understanding that transdisciplinary approaches, including, very importantly, recognition of multiple knowledge systems, ranging from Western science and indigenous knowledge systems, and sort of related not only to the information, but also the cultural and ethical aspects that relate to all of that. How do we build the ship, and how do we move forward on that? And the infrastructure piece, of which Labs Canada actually has a very significant role in, I believe plays an important role in addressing how we move forward with that. And we talked about, I think, it was raised about how cafeterias, in their own right. I mean, there's many organizations now and institutions, and I've worked in them, where cafeterias were being shut down, or you didn't want to talk about having cafeterias as part of the infrastructure. And yet, it's what brought people together. It brought not only the scientists and community within, but many of those venues were used to bring outside and public perspectives into sort of science fora, into discussions, having auditoriums, abilities in place where we actually can have open and respectful communication of sort of the challenges and issues that we need to have as a science community, and be open to very different perspectives on how we're going to approach it. So one of the things about the transdisciplinary piece to this is how can Labs Canada be an enabler to basically get that dialogue occurring very early, pre-design, like pre-blueprint. But if we are actually going to have facilities that truly encourage innovation and transdisciplinary discussions, do we build it differently? Are our labs, are we building more, hydrology centers or whatever it might be, or are these transdisciplinary centers for innovation in areas of topics that we're bringing and allowing very different types of scientists from academia, university, from government, private sectors to work together? And I think that's part of the challenge that we have is trying to move sort of the institutional history that we have with all of our programs. It doesn't matter who you're working for, and trying to look at how we can move forward in a way that we can make it work in a more effective manner. I wanted to raise one of the things on transdisciplinary that we were dealing with, and I was involved with a number of agreements that we tried to have between government and academic institutions for science co-location, co-appointments, etc. One of the main areas that came up was also science integrity and science communications. And who does the scientist work for when you are dealing with a blended model like this? And how is the data and information going to be used both collectively and reported to the public where you can? And then sometimes you can't, because there are, there are patent issues or other things that need to be worked out. But those are some of the areas that need to be worked on in terms of how we move forward to break some of those barriers down and allow that trans and interdisciplinary and cross-institutional arrangement be supported. But I think I really like one of the things that you mentioned. I think in terms of maybe let's start with the framework. Like let's maybe let's see what we could do in achieving. Maybe it'll be some pilot projects that we actually identify working with Labs Canada to say, let's use this as an example to see how we will address some of these institutional or mandate-driven barriers. Let's turn them and try to see if we can turn them into opportunities in terms of how we actually begin to address some of these areas. And that, to me, is the exciting part of this. I think we've got some very willing organizations and people to do it. It's a matter of getting down to it and seeing how we can, lead by example, and hopefully Labs Canada can actually help facilitate that.
Great. Well, I see that both Walter and Roseanne would like to add to this discussion, which is very exciting. I'm just going to raise, just for everybody's awareness, that we did get a question that feel free to integrate it into your response too, if it makes sense. But someone wrote, can a disciplinary approach be used to assess the social impact of emerging technologies and to help them to be successful? With that, though, Walter, I'll turn to you. You can weave that into your answer, or just feel free to address what you are going to add, and then I'll turn to Roseanne right after. Thank you.
Sure. Actually, I'll respond to that recent question first, and then I'll then carry on with Fred's theme. So I want to give you an example that we were fortunate enough to get a Canada First Research Excellence Fund project under the title of Future Energy Systems here at the University of Alberta. Very well funded, and involves, I would say probably 80% of it is STEM disciplines, but there is a substantial social sciences dimension to that. In terms of, there's a group within our Faculty of Arts called Petrocultures, which is looking at sort of the transitions that we all know we're going to have to go through as we move from where we are now to a low carbon economy, and the massive shift in employment that will happen as a result of that, and the retraining that will be necessary of those workers who work in the sort of traditional oil and gas sectors, and how they'll move into different employment opportunities, and the shifting of whole communities and the impacts of those changes on those communities. So it is possible to sort of weave in the sort of transdisciplinary aspect and the social impacts of emerging technologies into the bigger picture. And I think in many, that's just one example, but I think there are many examples of where there's a societal impact that needs to be assessed, along with the technological changes that we all see occurring in the world. So that's just a sort of a very rather superficial answer, but that's from my experience that I can respond to. What I wanted to pick up on is, and maybe this is a good link between Fred and Roseanne, because it involves both comments that they both made, And again, I want to give an example. Roseanne had said in her opening remarks, wouldn't it be great in an ideal world if, we could have somebody working in a federal lab who was, accessing equipment from academia, and maybe even, equipment that was applied for through CFI could be placed in a federal lab, and everybody could benefit. And we actually have a situation at our university where we've done sort of just that, and it's kind of a microcosm. It's not, I'm sure there's many other examples around the country where things like this happen. But I'll go back to what I said about our Nanotechnology Research Center, which is a joint partnership between NRC and the University of Alberta. And we have a program called the Nanotechnology Initiative, which involves joint research projects between NRC and the University of Alberta researchers. And in fact, each project has to be co-led by a federal researcher and a university academic. What it does, I think, is you kind of get the best of both worlds. It provides an HQP pipeline for the NRC researchers, so they can get access to excellent grad students, postdocs, et cetera, that perhaps they couldn't attract, through their system as easily. We get the benefit of in their knowledge and the whole network that's behind that particular NRC lab. We are able to share state-of-the-art equipment. In fact, many of the NRC researchers utilize our nanofab facility, which at last count had over 250 different tools for microfabrication and nanofabrication. They get access to that. We've recently placed a brand new acquisition in the NRC lab, which is shared by the researcher at the university who applied for it and his colleagues in NRC. So I think that's a good model that we could, Labs Canada could look at as something that, we maybe want to achieve in order to get the best use of public dollars. It also allowed us to start conversations with the leadership of the NRC, the DG within that facility, to look at other NRC programs, the NRC challenge areas, for example, that we have a lot of expertise that could feed into that. And so this sort of synergy, and it's got some momentum now. And I think that might be a model to think about for the future for Labs Canada. So I know Roseanne wants to talk, so I'll hand over to her.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Walter, and thank you, Natalka, for letting me say a few words, and Fred for having lit a little light bulb for me to say something. I think that the infrastructure really is an enabler for that transdisciplinary research. You have to have the space for it to occur. If you build all labs for one thing, it's hard to expand their purpose. It's hard to bring other people into it. So you need the initial space. We're dealing with labs that already exist in many cases. I was a university president. There was a lab on my campus, and I thought, it's a national research lab. I'm going to go visit it as, president of the university. I will go in and say hello to the researchers and see how we can collaborate and so on. I go to the door, and it's locked. So the first thing is the door has to be open. And I couldn't get in the door. I had to go back to my office and get my assistant to find out who was in charge of the keys to and get permission to be allowed in and get somebody to guide me in. Oh, okay, fine. So I do this, and I go in and I find that they're really nice people. They're there's no reason that they couldn't talk to me and I couldn't talk to them. And their biggest problem was that they were all age 60 and above, and they were extremely worried that they couldn't pass on their research to another generation. And not only that, they were working in the halls because there weren't enough labs. And at the university, we had another building that I had long imagined that we could just build a crosswalk and put offices on either side of the crosswalk and expand the space that we had. And they could expand their space, which happened. The students and faculty crossed, and it became a great example of a federal lab working with university, and things all worked out really well. Walter has given other examples. one thing we could do is make a list of all those examples and post them on the internet to inspire other people. I don't think we should wait till 3 years and 5 years. I think it's really great to have a plan, Hope, but I think we have to start today because it's changing people, and building facilities takes a while. And it takes time to change mindsets. So I think we need to find examples of what we're going to do and do it right away, and facilitate it. And you know, if our goal is to use transdisciplinary research to solve big problems, then we have researchers that are getting grants to do exactly that. They should be encouraged to work with the research labs, and the research labs are trying to do, the researchers there are trying to do the same thing. So it's, you know, how do we not do shotgun marriages, but how do we you know, provide the dating service that brings them together, and really make the goodwill that I see existing across the country come into something really good. One thing the pandemic taught me was that across the country, laboratories were ready to, you know, the people in the laboratories were ready to put down their project and collaborate with others to work on virus and antivirus and remedies and ventilators and whatever. They were ready to do that and work together. I think if given the opportunity, that would be really exciting for people to move ahead and do that. So working with labs that already exist, that are already there, if we open the door and we indicate we're ready to work, there, I think people will come. Just like with the CFI, we have this navigator where we list all the labs across the country. There are, you know, something like 62,000 people looked at it in the last month. You know, people will look and pick up on ideas. So I think part of our agenda should be, how do we make these things possible? Because Walter, you said, you know, we put our equipment in the federal labs. Some people have said to me, oh, you can't do that with CFI equipment. But of course you can. And so, you know, we need people to know that it's possible. And we need people to know that, you know, some federal labs had locks on their doors and they discovered that, you know, maybe you should share the combination and things will improve. So I think we have to just get over those initial humps. And when people see that it really works, more people will try and more people will succeed, and we will arrive at better solutions to the problems that we face. And Malcolm isn't able to speak, but I should say that Guelph is a great example of an institution that already works with Agriculture Canada, with Health Canada, and is building facilities that are available for research and industry and government. So, you know, there's a little plug for Malcolm.
Malcolm was going to speak to us a little bit more today on the agility and how do we design with that in mind. So I did put in a question. You might have not seen it, or maybe nobody wants to touch it, but one of the questions that you do hear in the public realm is, how do we make science more accessible to the public? And when we're thinking through some of these transdisciplinary questions and designing lab with sort of our thoughts on how do we engage with the public, how do we create programs, how do we support the programs that the federal sciences are designing to make it more accessible to the public. It's interesting that we're having those conversations when we're still trying to understand, how do you make collaboration between academia and government better? How do you improve collaboration with industry and the federal government when there's questions of intellectual property, there's questions of competition. So I'm just going to put it out there. Hope somebody helps me out and doesn't just leave dead air here. But I would love for you to maybe talk about how do you, in your realms of institution, are you able to engage on the public on some of these big questions that we're collectively trying to address? Don't leave me hanging. Anybody?
So you know, one of the ways is citizen scientists, and to involve citizen scientists in the work that we do. I remember when I was in Nova Scotia, there was at the time I thought he was ancient, but he's now really ancient. He was collecting data for Environment Canada at a little post, and he had done it for like 25 or 30 years already. And Environment Canada stopped collecting that data, but he continued. As far as I know, he's still doing it. And he goes to the schools and shows the students the variations in the climate fluctuations. And he's done all kinds of work. So there's getting citizens involved in science, which is a great thing to do. I know most of the major science installations across the country. You mentioned Triumph, and Walter's the chair of the board of Triumph. They have special sessions for young people, and I know the Ocean Networks goes up the coast and works with the Indigenous populations to teach people about science. The CFI just did a survey of 1,500 young people across the country and found out the good news is that they like science, they appreciate and value science. The hard to take news is their source of information is not always the same as our transmission. So we don't do TikTok. So we may have to look at other ways of communication than we do today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just had a great image of the TikTok. That's great. The scientists doing some grooves or dancing. That would go a long way. I have Hope and Fred would like to weigh in on this as well. Over to you, Hope.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is my TikTok version, but I think we should be able to incorporate that. And I think the idea of citizen science is a really great starting point to get us thinking about what do Canadians and perhaps people throughout the world want to know, and what do they want us to be working on. And so learning more about that is really helpful. And how to go about asking the research question and addressing the research question in the way that best serves the population is something I think we need to do better. And then to come full circle, once we've done the work that we feel we've done enough engagement on and we've done it right, we need to get the message back out there. What did we do? What did we learn? And what are we going to benefit in terms of that research, whatever it might be? And maybe TikTok's one venue, maybe the schools are another, maybe other media is important too, because we have to think about all age groups and how to reach all age groups, whether they be just growing and they're 5 or 10 years old and getting excited about science, but maybe that, older sector would be important to reach out to as well, especially depending on the nature of the question. So we need to keep that knowledge translation in mind from the beginning of the project. Are we doing this right? And then getting the message out. What did we learn and where do we need to go next?
Mm-hmm. Over to you, Fred, and then Catalina.
Yeah, just again, building on what's been said so far, I would also add that, again, coming from an infrastructure point of view, keeping in mind that public engagement and involvement is a core element and an important component of science design and delivery, then that should help shape how the infrastructure is actually going to be designed and implemented. And there are examples in Canada on campuses and other areas where new facilities are being put in with basically showcasing labs no longer are just behind solid walls, but floor to ceiling windows and public atria and areas where you can have meetings and you actually see science in action. I mean, there's another example. I mean, this is historical. The Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, that's in Drumheller, an area you actually not only get to bring your family and see science in action, that the displays, but actually you can look into labs and you can actually see work that's being done, and it generates a different interaction between the public community and the science community that's actually using those facilities. I think the same thing, Walter's, occurred with the new museum in Edmonton, the Natural History Museum, where again you can view, in terms of their archives and their areas, or some public again specific space that allows for that interaction between the science communities and the disciplines and the public. But again, that would have to be something at the onset, that this is a part of knowledge translation, communication, and working with the public in terms of delivery of science. And again, I think Labs Canada has a role and mandate to help be enabler of that at least that conversation and discussion of how you move forward on that.
Over to you, Catalina.
Thank you. And well, echoing some of the comments, I think, the work on citizen science, we actually have some projects that are involving citizen scientists in forestry genomics, looking at the forestry health and looking for pests and pathogens. So we have another one in Quebec on wastewater. They're collecting samples for water pathogen monitoring on water and wastewater. So there is great opportunities for citizen scientists and citizens to participate in all those initiatives around genomics. Also, what I wanted to bring is what the European Commission and countries like Ireland are doing now that they are moving from program-focused research into a mission-driven research. And to define those missions, they are doing these large public consultations. Before they define the priorities, the agencies are consulting with the public, with the citizens. And as we were saying, they're looping back. As soon as they select the areas where they want to focus, they will loop back to the community. So there's really more and more innovative and inclusive ways to bring the public, to bring the communities. The other aspect that we, in particular at Genome Canada, are thinking about now that we're working on mission-driven and moving, again, from programs to missions, is to also start thinking about some of the potential, as we call it, gels, but that could be the social, regulatory, legal challenges. And to give an example, with Cancogen again, one of the biggest challenges has been data sharing. And we, at the beginning, didn't realize that was going to be such a big challenge. We basically realized this probably half the way of Cancogen, and we created a portal, and we created a series of mechanisms to promote and push for the data sharing. But knowing that from the get-go, from the beginning of the project, you might then design your project in a whole different way. You might design your funding structures and all the initiatives in a different way, because then you're giving priority to, or you're thinking ahead of time on some of those potential barriers that you will encounter when you will go into implementation, instead of waiting to encounter them, just trying to, and some of them, data sharing, we know some of those challenges ahead of time. So I think there's a good learning again for us from Cancogen, and good learning in involving, again, the multidisciplinary approach and involving, the communities. We're, as I mentioned before, we're doing projects also where we're involving indigenous traditional knowledge as part of the way to help us advance the implementation of genomics. So yeah, those are some examples that I think could bring that concept of a more inclusive and more multidisciplinary, including citizens and including different groups in our society.
Much. And Walter, over to you to add to this.
Sure, it's interesting. The more I hear, the more it triggers different thoughts. But just to continue the theme that Catalina just mentioned about sort of Indigenous ways of knowing, we host the Canadian Mountain Network, which is a networks of centers of excellence. And that program is, as you know, being sunsetted, but that particular I think that particular initiative will continue into the future. But part of that is the creation of what they call knowledge hubs, where they use both Western science and Indigenous ways of knowing, and look at things like river and water health, looking at salmon spawning trends, looking at grizzly bear populations, and increasingly sort of like caribou migration patterns, all of these kinds of things that are very relevant to those communities, but also involve, you've probably heard of the Guardians program, where Indigenous volunteers will go out and educate people from an Indigenous perspective on what to look for in terms of environmental health from that perspective, but also matching that up with Western science methods as well. So that's one example where you can involve so-called citizen scientists. But also, Fred mentioned the provincial museum we have here, and also something called the TELUS World of Science, which is another fantastic facility that we have in Edmonton. And one of the Arctic exhibitions that's being built and planned right now will involve a sort of a historical look at the glaciation patterns resulting from the Ice Age. And we have a CFI-funded program called the Canadian Ice Core Lab, which was created a number of years ago, where we basically took over the ice cores from NRCan, and they were moved to Edmonton, and they're being studied as wonderful monitors of global climate change, et cetera, because you have this information, these gases in these frozen ice cores, that you can see what was the greenhouse gas concentrations in 1,000 years ago, et cetera. So that is something that we're partnering with TELUS World of Science on, to allow the public, and particularly children, to get really involved in that and to understand what those sentinels are telling us about the climate and the climate change. So I think that'll be a very interesting project going forward that involves the public. So just a couple of things to add to the mix.
Thank you very much. So we only have a few minutes, 8 minutes left. So this will give you each an opportunity to share anything you'd like to share. It could be anything provocative or something that we didn't touch upon that you wish that we had touched upon. So some of the things that I've heard that I found very interesting and made me think is location. So labs are very much location based, and we think of them as brick and mortars. And yet you've mentioned a couple of ideas that are outside, that involve communities in remote locations. So, always a thought about how do we think about laboratories differently, as maybe being outside more, being more interactive. So anyways, just a couple of thoughts there, but that's my thought. You can have anything you'd like to add, just to kind of leave us thinking. And so I'll just open it up. Oh, Rosette, go ahead. We'll start with you.
Well, we actually, in our grant applications, changed the word. Well, we do still talk about laboratories, but we talk about environments. And that was done very purposefully. And we actually have considered a forest. We've considered greenhouses. We've considered fields as laboratories. We've considered spaces in homes for senior citizens as research spaces. And so that is really important. It is important for us to adjust that idea. The other thing is that years ago, we only funded how many square feet were in that laboratory. We did not include the space in the middle where people came together and talked. But we did not include the place where they educated young people about the projects that were happening in the labs. And we've revisited that so that we can actually consider that part of the research as we move forward. So it's a kind of a definition of what we mean by laboratories, and maybe we are all a living laboratory, but we have to still find some way that we scale that. But I think that is a very, very important idea that you have, Natalka, and knowing that climate change is a really big issue, and Walter's mentioned it. I know Fred is working on a similar issue, and knowing that it's one of the most important issues in the world, and the importance that our country is attaching to it at this time. I know the research councils are talking about making a special thrust for all researchers to work, to do environmental research. I'm thinking, is there a way that we could say that one of the, maybe the first translational field that we would look at would be environment, and make it a challenge for the research agencies, for labs, for CFI, all to think about how we support a kind of research environment, research actually happening, and the researchers and the next generation of researchers that will ensure that our environment is better for the future, and that it promotes human habitation.
That's a beautiful way to end our conversation. Does anybody else like to add anything to what Roseanne added before I close? Well, oh, go ahead, Fred.
Well, just very quickly, I mean, building again on Roseanne's and other comments, I think, again, this highlights the importance of communicating opportunities, both within and across organizations, and maybe put up some of these. We've often heard in the university worlds and other areas, grand challenges that we're facing in terms of putting together our programs and infrastructure in other areas. But maybe, again, it comes back to identifying some of these thematic areas where, again, we think outside of the box, that infrastructure is actually not necessarily just bricks and mortar. We're looking at sort of, I think you used the term, Natalka, hub and spoke kind of perspectives, where we're actually also looking at both hardwired, but also maybe unquote soft-wired connectivity between facilities and laboratories and opportunities, and looking at some of the other elements we talked about, which is co-appointments, co-agreements, trying to address some of these barriers in a much more systematic way, which is the way that, again, what Hope raised earlier about maybe we start with trying to develop a framework that we could apply to an issue and address some of these areas that we talked about today in a more systematic manner, involving multiple parties to do that. I think that's where the exciting opportunities will come up, and maybe we'll raise some of the issues and help address some of the issues that we raise as panelists today to help inform Labs Canada how to move forward on this.
Well, I have 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to close by summarizing some of the topics that I've heard. And I can say that in an hour and a half, we've touched on a lot of topics. And it wouldn't have happened without all of your contributions. So just in case I run out of time, I want to make sure that I thank each and every one of you for joining us today, and for raising the topics and the issues and the themes that you did. And so some of the ones that I've captured, I really like the idea of thinking of positioning science in these, what they called wicked problems, big problems, frameworks, grand challenges. So that's something, thematic areas that all of you mentioned. And it seems, Catalina spoke to very much the pandemic. It seems like sometimes that's what it takes, is something urgent standing or staring right in front of us that we all need to pull together, no matter what institution we work with, to contribute to that solution. And that includes our citizens. So again, it's the citizens do want to be involved. And so we need to think about laboratories differently. They're not just what they used to be in our bricks and mortars with their equipment. They're now, as Roseanne really nicely put, they can be in kitchen tables, they could be in greenhouses, in the fields, in the forest. And the contributions don't only come from researchers and science trained people, they come from various traditional knowledge, various, whether it be your farmers, it comes from all over, so that we really look at things differently. I loved the idea of cafeteria science. So as we become fiscally constrained, let's not sacrifice the cafeterias. I heard from many of you mentioning that is where a lot of ideas come together. It's when people share a meal that a lot of these ideas will come out. Communicate opportunities, really bring it back to the people, and build puzzles. So think of our infrastructures as puzzles that come together. Thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.